Good morning. Still good morning here. LA Prepper with a short, uh, under 15 minutes, anyways. I'll try to keep it under 10 minutes. Video, kind of a VR video response to one of my subscribers, Johnny Bob Drudge, who has been putting out some real truth recently. He was talking about the Second Amendment and specifically how it relates to um, a well-regulated militia. So, if you don't know what a militia is, it's essentially a group of locals that are armed, not necessarily with firearms, but choose to organize themselves to help maintain, law and order to a certain extent, but also to prevent, you know, not just domestic tyranny, really, but sort of like any sort of thing that would threaten the security of, like the American way of life. Doesn't have to be a corrupt government, doesn't have to be foreign invaders, or could be something even like riots or like gang related things, or this group or that group, or it's not the point of the militia is not what they're planning on, like defending of, like fighting against. The reason, at least in my opinion, the reason you join a militia is not because you're trying to foment violence or aggression against any particular group. The reason you want to associate with a militia would be to sort of increase your local area's ability to stay strong in the event that things get crazy. At least that's the way that I look at it. A militia is really a self defense force, and it's not an aggressive force. The militia's not going to say, we got to go take over, or we got to go free. If I'm in Los Angeles, I don't know if it's necessarily sensible that the local militia would say, you know, San Diego is getting crazy. Let's go down to San Diego and liberate them, or something. I mean, militias have their own values and their own feelings on a variety of things. Like there are militias that, for example, I'll give you a couple recent examples of U.S. history when militias have kind of been active. In this Bundy incident up in Oregon, as far as I understand, I think he was trying to like do some ranching with cattle or something. Not just cattle, but he was sort of working federal land, and I think they were trying to kind of kick him off or tell him that he couldn't do some stuff out there, and he was trying to argue that it was his right as a citizen to do what he was doing out there based on different things. I'm not really going to get into the details of it. Definitely look it up. But the point is, there were other Americans, some in militias and some otherwise, who felt strongly enough about what was going on up there that they went to go assist. So that is an example of, when those militias were created, whether it was recently or months ago or years ago, they didn't form with the idea, we're going to go help this guy Bundy. That it wasn't. But when he started having issues, yeah, grazing fees. I guess he didn't want to pay grazing fees or something. So when Bundy started having these issues with the government, became more popular, some of the local militias, sometimes who sort of have this feeling that the federal government is very onerous in taxation and regulation and just in a variety of ways. Um, they went to go stand with him. So that's one example. Another example of where militias sometimes are active is on the border. There are certain militias that feel that border patrol is not being handled appropriately, that we're just letting people across like a floodgate. So they're taking upon themselves to put themselves on the border to, some of them I think are taking it to the ultimate level of like trying to perform citizen's arrest or something like that. Others might be communicating to law enforcement what they're noticing. But whatever their actions are, it's not really, the point if they're within the law. But it's that just, another example of types of activities that militias do. Another fairly common activity that a lot of militias have been known to do is show up at protests in states where it's legal to open carry or in states where it's legal to concealed carry. Members sometimes will come concealed carry, which is depending on their location. If they're within their state and federal law to conceal carry wherever the protest is, fine. So they'll show up at protests to partly to exercise, to sort of, ostensibly it's, to sort of keep the peace and maybe at the same time, show their political feelings about carrying firearms. But, let's be clear, whatever their statement is, the fact that they have firearms, it doesn't necessarily give strength to their statement, but it protects them, at least in the physical sense, that it's much less likely that other agitators or law enforcement or anyone is going to sort of be motivated, to sort of physically assault them. Because, honestly, we've seen, you might think, oh, well, what are you talking about random people committing violence? We have seen protests, and not just recently, not just with this Antifa stuff, but people have been getting more violent in public. I wouldn't, violence and like violent crime sort of nominally is down, but there's still a lot of extremes in protests in general. People can get a little bit crazy. So I don't think it's inappropriate for, some of these militias to show up to these protests armed if they're within their rights and within the law, just purely as a matter of self-preservation. Because, I don't go to protests personally. California doesn't have good open carry laws. Maybe if I could open carry, and I wouldn't even, to be honest, even as I feel strongly about firearm rights, and even if open carry was legal in California, and even if California was more like Texas, where it was a little more friendly in public, and people weren't so violated in their safe space by seeing someone open carry, probably wouldn't do it a lot. And maybe that's just I think that's the Californian in me speaking. Just because I know other people would freak out about it, it's not because I wouldn't want to do it. It's because, even if it was legal, the amount of negative attention in California you would get for open carrying, you know, socially speaking, people would just harass you, call the cops on you, and just it would be really frustrating. So how do I feel about open militia? Well-regulated militias. I'm not a Supreme Court justice, and when you're talking about what does this law mean, what does this amendment mean, what do the Bill of Rights mean, kind of have to be in the Supreme Court or in the judicial system to really define it. Even though a lot of the laws are written in a way that give the rights to the people, it can be somewhat of a risky thing to just go about your life and say, I have the right to do this because I'm a citizen of America, blah, blah, blah. I have a right to drink wine in the park or something. You're going to end up getting arrested for having an open container. And when you try to appeal the open container because it's unconstitutional, that's not, even though there might be like a really loose argument on, that it's not expressly forbidden in the Constitution to drink alcohol in public or something like that. The chance that you're going to get anywhere in the legal system on that kind of case is not, it's not really high. And not to say that you should only fight for those things that have a good chance of winning in court. It's not really the way the Constitution is supposed to work. But you have to be a little careful in this country about trying to strictly interpret the Constitution and living like that. Um, the federal government has become very, very large. There are a very great number of institutions that all have their own priorities. Even if the sheriff is okay with what you're doing, are the park rangers okay with what you're doing? Is Fish and Game okay with what you're doing? Is the EPA okay with what you're doing? Is the local police okay with what you're doing? Is and on and on and on. And I'm not advocating for like a Wild West type of existence or some anarchy type system, but anything that you do in this world, the amount of laws and rules and regulations that have been layered upon layered upon layer and written by attorney after attorney after attorney, it's dizzying. It's mind-boggling. You can't even believe how many books and books and books there are of codes, civil codes, codes on this, criminal codes, regulations and laws. And it's ludicrous. It's just, excuse me, that's one of my words I use too much, but it's just unbelievable. So why is that important? Um, Unless the law is clearly on your side, when you're acting as an American citizen, you're going to encounter resistance from society. Now, if you try to start a militia tomorrow, are you going to encounter resistance from society? Probably not. Especially not if you're meeting at Denny's and it's like you and your buddy or something. But if you are part of a militia and you go start to try to enforce the border, are you going to encounter resistance? Possibly. Depends on what the border patrol in that area feels like. If you have some friends that are retired military or maybe retired LEO, maybe you get along with the border patrol. If you're just, Billy Bob and Tom and Johnny and whoever, just kind of regular guys, not trying to be like derogatory with like Billy Bob or anything, but just regular country guys, maybe the border patrol is not as friendly to a bunch of civilians, going around with firearms in their area. I don't know. If you show up to a bunch of protests, what do the local law enforcement think about your militia? What's the history of your militia? Does your militia get crazy, or is your militia quiet and reserved? Are you non-confrontational? Are you confrontational? What did the law enforcement think of the militia at Bundy? You'd really have to ask them. In fact, maybe just for the sake of argument, let me check the time real quick. Oh, 13 minutes. Okay, got to wrap it up. Maybe I should look into some of the Bundy videos, sort of like a 3 years past, April to May. Yeah, so we're just 3 years past, and kind of look at that and see what happened. There were certainly, probably most of the time, that it was nonviolent. And if you think that people armed has nothing to do with how violent it is, I think you're definitely wrong. I would argue that the more equally sort of matched both sides are, probably the less chance of violence. Because no matter who's in the right, the bottom line is, if things get escalated to a violent level, it doesn't matter if you were legally in the right to shoot someone or they were legally in the right to shoot you. People are still getting injured. People are still, going to the hospital or worse. So nobody on either side, no American loving citizen who's a militia member, who is sane, and no law enforcement officer or public servant, who loves their country, wants to harm another American. So this idea that, militia showing up with the guns, or the police and enforcement showing up with all their guns, and they're evil and they're the bad government, or the militia is evil and they're domestic terrorists, you got to kind of separate crazy people doing crazy shit and bad apples in a group, which are the minority. And you have to separate someone owning an object to that categorizing them. Even if some people, crazy people, have this thing that they do or that they own or that they are, doesn't mean everyone that owns or does or is that thing is going to be crazy. There's causation and there's correlation. One is, you know, smokers often have lighters because they need lighters to smoke. That's correlation. High correlation between people who have lighters and people who smoke cigarettes. Does that mean anyone with a lighter is going to be a smoker? Absolutely not. It also doesn't mean that anyone that smokes is necessarily going to have a lighter on them. So just because someone is in a militia, does it mean they're correlated to feel that the government is very strong and owners? Possibly. Does it mean it's a high correlation that they might own firearms? Yeah. Does it mean there's a correlation that there might be a prepper? Sure. Does it mean they are a prepper? No. Does it mean that they are totally crazy about firearms? No. Does it mean that they think the government is, it doesn't definitely mean those things, even if it does most of the time. So, how do I feel about militia? It's complicated. Just because it's a constitutional right, that's a really difficult thing to interpret because when law enforcement, for example, if you're a militia and you're organizing and you're doing something, maybe local law enforcement is sort of questioning what you're doing, that idea of, what is a militia? What are they allowed to do? What kind of things can they do? It's a difficult question for everyone. It's difficult for the people in the militia. It's difficult for the enforcement. It's difficult for the courts. It's difficult for the lawmakers. It's not a simple answer. So as far as what I would recommend, I would do some soul searching. I try to live a life that doesn't cause friction with other entities, regardless of whether or not I think I have a right to do something or not. I'm trying to, kind of go with the flow in life. And at least personally, right now, even though I suppose, there is benefit to, organizing with a militia, I'm, I'm just kind of a regular guy with a 22 rifle, and I've camped a couple times. I'm not sure I would be like, if there was a militia draft, I don't think I would be the first pick. And that's not really the point of a militia, but, um, there's some factors going against me right now. My occupation with school, living in California, things like that, which you might say maybe that's a better reason to join a militia. But right now, I'm going to be honest and say that, associating with a militia is not really high on my list. Doesn't mean that I judge people differently based on their feelings about that. Um, it's a really interesting topic, especially in this day and age when we have violence in public. We have a lot of interesting stuff going on. So like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.